Thank you for joining on time and waiting. Since you are early, we have the privilege of asking you where you're from. So maybe in the chat, if you can write where you're from and any introduction that you would want to give, it would be great. San Francisco Bay Area, Montana, Langley, Canada, Arlington, Michigan. Oh my God, this is like we have not traveled, but we are traveling through all these names and places here on Zoom. This is fascinating. Seattle. Maybe we'll wait for maybe 1 more minute. It's already past 1 and we have a lot to cover, and we have this very exciting panel and lots of discussions. Pleasant Hill, California. Great, a lot of people from California. I guess the timing really worked out. Great to have you all here. And just to let everyone know, this is not a regular panel session. So we will have a lot of interaction. So please keep sending your questions on the chat, and we will make sure that we pick up those questions from your chat. Thanks for being on time and thanks for joining this panel. I hope the conference is going very well. And I hope everyone is following COP26 and all the other things that are happening on the sidelines and on your streets and everywhere. So thanks for taking the time to be here with us today. As I said earlier on, please feel free to keep sending your questions in the chat. We will be taking lots of questions. This is a more conversational, more audience friendly discussion than our usual panels. Okay, so I think it's already a couple of minutes past 1, and just with the interest of time, and since all of you are already on time, I think let's start, and hopefully a lot of other folks will join. So this is a panel on responding to climate change through education, data, and methods. So it will be focusing a lot on latest research on climate change education, including psychosocial barriers to action and how climate education can overcome these barriers. We will also be focusing on successful models of climate focus projects based on our review around the world. And then we have panelists who will be discussing the potential impact of climate change education as compared to other environmental interventions. So really, this is the status of climate change education with respect to data and methods. So you are at the right panel. Thanks for joining me. I'm Radhika Iyengar. I work at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Earth Institute, Columbia University. I think I'm a lifelong learner of sustainability in practice at home and trying to be a sustainable community person as well as a sustainable, learner about research. So this is a great panel to be moderating because I'll get to learn a lot, and I hope you have the same intentions also. So since I said earlier on that we will be having, this is a more conversational panel, we will be having opening remarks from our panelists today. And then I'll have maybe a round of questions, maybe 2 questions each to each of the panelists. And in between, I will be taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to add your questions for each one of the, if you can write the name of the panelists, that will be great, to whom you're pointing the question to in the chat, and we'll be taking those questions there. If time permitting, then maybe we can have like a rapid fire round of one question again with the panelists, but we'll see how it goes. I hope we get a lot of questions from all of you so that, we get more interaction and more flavor to our discussion. Before we start the panel, I want to introduce our super panelists. I'm so excited that we have such esteemed panelists with us today. We have Alison Bowers. She is a research consultant and methodologist with a PhD in educational research and evaluation. She's worked as a field-based environmental educator and special education teacher. So really learning from the ground up, including her research. Through her current work, though her current work is with Professor Nicole Ardoin's Social Ecology Lab at Stanford University. She's involved in several projects focused on design thinking, collective action, climate change, and research review. So really, we'll get to learn a lot from Alison through her extensive research. Then we have we have Christina. Christina Kwok is an education consultant and a research director at Unbounded Associates, a future rising visiting scholar at Girls Rising, and a non-resident fellow in the Center for Universal Education and Brookings. She has co-authored many books and many policy briefs, which I'm really a fan of. One of them is with Jean Spearling and Rebecca Winthrop on girls' education and getting the best evidence out of why girls' education is important in terms of climate. And also a new book that we've released together on curriculum and learning for climate action towards an SDG 4.7 roadmap for systems change. She's also published the new Green Learning Agenda, Approaches to Quality Education for Climate Empowerment, and she is an advisory member of many different organizations, including Girls Rising, including Drawdown Lift Advisory Council, UNESCO Prize for Girls Education. So I think she is really the best person to discuss policy as well as practice. Thank you, Christina, for joining. And then we have Dr. Eugene Cordero is a climate scientist and a professor at the Department of Meteorology and Climate Science at San Jose State University. Eugene's science research is focused on understanding changes in atmospheric temperatures through observations and models. Eugene is also interested in design of educational experiences and encourage leadership and action on climate change. Eugene is also founder of Green Ninja, and I think everyone, I'll send the link also here, everyone needs to really look up Green Ninja. They've been doing a fascinating job and as a science publisher, and he's also uses solutions to climate and environmental problems as a lens for teaching science. So you can see the breadth of the expertise that we have here today. I'll hand over to our first discussant. Maybe Alison, if you can take over and do a quick round of introduction, and then we'll follow up with a round of questions.
Thank you for that introduction. It always sounds so much better when someone else describes what you've done. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you all today. I was asked by Marcia McKenzie of MEES to present when she wasn't able to, and I'm so appreciative of the opportunity, and we'll be sharing some about MEES as well as the project that I'm specifically involved in under MEES. So as mentioned, I'm a researcher in Professor Nicole Ardoin's Social Ecology Lab at Stanford, and Professor Ardoin is a co-investigator on the MEES project, and I've been working on the MEES work in our lab for over a year now. So I wanted to briefly introduce the MEES project and then share a bit on the research review we've been working on that's focused on psychosocial barriers to climate change action and what these barriers might mean for educators. So the MEES project stands for Monitoring and Evaluating Climate Communication and Education. It's a global collaborative research program working to increase both the quality and quantity of climate change communication and education to advance global climate literacy and action. MEES is a partnership of over 80 leading scholars and agencies, including the IPCC, the UNFCCC, and UNESCO, working to tackle the challenge of quickly advancing climate change communication and education globally. A main goal is to provide evidence-based insights to policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to support decision-making. It's a $4.5 million 6-year project with main funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The MEIS project conceptualizes climate change communication and education as going beyond increasing scientific literacy to also engage psychosocial and action dimensions necessary for catalyzing change across political systems, technical responses, and personal values and beliefs. MEIS researchers make a point to consider target audiences within their social context, where they're influenced by a variety of factors such as education and culture. Keeping in mind the dual purpose of MEIS, a focus on quality and quantity, it's organized around 3 intersecting activities. The first is focused on evaluating and improving the quality of climate change communication and education. And this first area includes 3 knowledge syntheses examining psychosocial factors, regional and cultural considerations, and indicator refinement. MEIS researchers are developing 50 to 70 country profiles of climate change communication and education, and 30 case studies of climate change communication and education, which I'll talk about at the end. The second activity is data set and indicator development to support monitoring and target setting for climate change communication and education. Work in this area includes identifying indicator areas and relevant data sets, developing robust indicators, comparing country and regional patterns, and supporting the usage of data and indicators. And finally, the third activity is knowledge mobilization to support intergovernmental and national policymakers, education and communication audiences. As part of this area, MEIS is developing policy briefs, fact sheets, guidelines, blogs, newsletters, and hosts an interactive data platform, webinars, and regional hub network. Our work in Stanford Social Ecology Lab has been under the case studies and knowledge synthesis area, and we're conducting a systematic review of peer-reviewed empirical research that looks at the psychosocial barriers of climate change action. We've reviewed over 1,300 abstracts, and our final sample includes 99 studies. These studies come from over 21 countries in Asia, Europe, Australia, and North and South America. They represent numerous fields in the social sciences, such as psychology, sociology, communication, and interdisciplinary environmental studies. The studies looked at factors of climate change action using a variety of methods, such as surveys, interviews, and experiments. The studies looked at adaptation, sometimes mitigation, a range of actors at various scales, and multiple endpoints, including action, policy support, and beliefs and attitudes. We are currently wrapping up the analysis and writing a paper, and that will include reflections on the implications for climate change education and communication. I wanted to share some quick preliminary findings that we have. The studies revealed that there is a complex web of factors and context, that figuring out why people take climate change action, it's a complicated story. That it also depends on the context, where they are, who's around them, as well as personal and individual values and beliefs. A common theme we found is that while knowledge and awareness certainly play a role in action, there's much more to this story. Researchers have examined the role of emotions, ideology, values, social norms, and lived experience, among others. Another theme we're seeing is this idea of different forms of climate change denial. We saw a lot of research on denial driven by ideology, but also seeing this interest in denial based on protective denial, that people, it's so much to handle that they decide they're going to deny climate change. And so it obviously leads to inaction. That for educators, we believe this suggests a focus on supporting youth and adults to take meaningful climate action. So this means education needs to be skill-based, solution-focused, rather than focusing on doom and gloom and the enormity of the problem. Finally, I wanted to share something about MEIS's offering. It's a call for case study proposals. They are looking at case studies of innovative climate change education and communication with a focus on social learning and local place-based solutions, climate justice, and learners across all stages of life. It is 10,000 Canadian dollars per case study over a 1-year period. You can go to the MEIS website for more details, and the deadline to apply is January 4th. So thank you for that opportunity. And Radhika, am I throwing to Christina or Eugene? I'm sorry, I don't know.
Christina. Thank you, Alison, for the introduction.
Thanks so much. All right, so with BECC happening simultaneously with COP26 this year, my preparations for today's panel took a slightly different turn than what I had anticipated when we first submitted the panel abstract. For a few years now, I've been looking at the evidence connecting education and climate change and trying to identify entry points for raising education's profile when it comes to climate solutions, in particular, national countries, or a country's national climate strategies, their adaptation plans, their nationally determined contributions, and so on. And so, you know, our panel is focused on the data, it's focused on methods, but I wanted to sort of tell a story that starts with, you know, where our communication is falling short in terms of really leveraging the data for the kind of action that this crisis really calls for. So on the one hand, we have an abundance of evidence that demonstrates climate change's impact on the education system, global education systems, and especially on the educational disruptions of adolescent girls in low and middle income countries, as well as children, you know, around the world, especially in climate vulnerable countries. So we have evidence from multiple climate related disasters. We can go back, you know, to 2013 and Super Typhoon Haiyan, for example, that killed more than 6,000 people in the Philippines. It damaged or destroyed more than 3,000 schools and daycare centers, disrupted the education of more than 1 million children, placed 49,000 girls and women at risk of sex trafficking due to their displacement in crowded and unsafe shelters. We can look at, you know, the other part of the world. We can look at Cyclone Idai and its disruption of more than 300,000 children's education in Mozambique, landslides in Sierra Leone. I mean, the list goes on in terms of the evidence that shows us the impacts today that climate change is having on education systems. On the other hand, we also have evidence of the impact that education can have on climate, both in terms of climate resilience, climate adaptive capacity, reducing mortality during climate-related disasters, the potential for education to catalyze broader systems change. We have, you know, ample and increasing evidence around these different dimensions, and Eugene will certainly talk a little bit about that with his research in a moment. We've got increasing public support for teaching climate change in school. In the US context, as an example, I think it's 2 out of 3 Republicans, 9 out of 10 Democrats support the teaching of climate change in education and in school contexts. An overwhelming majority of teachers are eager to do so as well. They do feel that there are barriers to doing so in terms of professional development, training, relevant learning materials, something that Eugene is also addressing with his work with Green Ninja. And then we also have students who are demanding climate change to be taught in schools and for climate policy to take bolder actions at the systemic level. But world leaders are not paying attention to this data. They're not paying attention to the rising tide of voices saying that there needs to be something done in our education system. Recently, I did some work with Education International, world's organization of teacher unions around the world, representing, I think, over more than 5 million teachers around the world. And we graded 95 countries' nationally determined contributions. These are the countries' national strategies that they submit to the UNFCCC, and in this case, ahead of COP26. And, you know, thinking about the methods portion of our talk today, together with Education International, we developed a set of metrics to really try to kind of raise awareness around the inclusion of education in climate policies, and really trying to lift the bar when it comes to climate change education ambition. And so we developed what we're calling the Education International Climate Change Ambition, or Climate Change Education Ambition Report Card, which has 6 primary indicators, or 6 primary metrics, and about 30 indicators for measuring countries' approaches to climate change education. And just to give you a sense of that, we include policy ambition. So, you know, whether or not climate change education is included in climate strategies, the prevalence, whether or not it's included across the education system, across levels of education, across different curricular entry points, the inclusion aspects of the policy as well, whether or not it's attending to vulnerable populations, including teachers in the policy development process. We also have metrics around the quality of that climate change education, whether it's based in science, whether it's transdisciplinary, intersectional, addresses climate justice. And because climate justice features as such an important aspect of quality climate change education, we also had a separate indicator, a separate set of indicators on climate justice and system strengthening, and whether or not countries are attending to the need to actually fund public education systems, train teachers, ensure there's adequate curricular material, and so on. And in our analysis, every country failed. Not a single country met all of our criteria. We found that only 20 countries, NDCs, were actually talking about climate change education. So, this just points to this lack of transfer of the data, the research to the policy spaces, to the decision makers. And this has tremendous impact, not only on the future of the status of the planet, but on present health, mental health and well-being of youth. Another study just recently published, I think, in Lancet, points to how youth around the world are feeling betrayed by their governments for not taking adequate, bold action. More than half of the 10,000 youth surveyed across 10 countries feel that humanity is doomed and that they won't have access to the same kinds of opportunities that their parents did. And 83% of the young people surveyed believe that people are just failing to take care of the planet. And so when we look at this, this kind of just shortcoming, this gap, this absence just really points to how, even though we are generating evidence and data, this isn't moving policy in the direction that we need to see it going. And this will have, tremendous implications for us. Another aspect at COP26 that I thought was particularly interesting was Prime Minister Boris Johnson actually saying, we need to be afraid, not, of the delegates in the room, but the children and the children not yet born who will be judging us for the actions that we are not taking today. So, maybe there is hope still that there will be a little bit more movement there. But I just want to kind of close my thoughts here and talk a little bit about, well, what kind of education should we be looking for? What does it look like and what should it look like on the ground? And this is where some of the research that I've done in the past around a new green learning agenda, around sort of our call to action around climate change or climate action projects in every school around the world comes into play. And we're thinking that it's not just any kind of education. It's not just about climate science. It's not just about individual actions, but it's really about beginning to open the doors to how climate change is a political issue. It's a systems issue. It's a human rights issue, an issue of justice, equity, and equality. And we have ample examples around the world of classrooms, schools, beginning to really tackle this at an intersectional level. So just as a couple of examples, and then I'll conclude my opening remarks. For example, in Zimbabwe, in a district in rural Zimbabwe, CARE Zimbabwe has begun to implement solar panel or solar powered water pumps in rural areas that are facing not only challenges with drought, but also increased rates of flooding because of the droughts and then the onset of heavy rains, erratic rain patterns, and have just begun to disrupt not only children's schooling, but also livelihoods. And so they installed these solar powered water pumps as a way to bring water, a continuous source of water to schools during these periods of erratic water access. But it wasn't just the solar powered water pumps. It was the educational endeavor that happened around the water pumps that really unlocked the transformative potential of education. So not only were students trained to learn the engineering around these solar water pumps, but they ensured that there was equal representation of student leadership among girls and boys to run this solar powered water project. that fed into an aquaponics garden system to ensure that community members had a consistent source of livelihood during the food insecure periods that drought also brought in. And then on top of that, they integrated project planning and then studies around aquaponics and agriculture. They had accounting, project management, all alongside science and mathematics that led to increased learning outcomes for students in these schools, increased outcomes for girls who were more likely to drop out during intense periods of climate-related shocks. So increase their attendance as well as increase the community resilience to drought. And this is just one of many examples that exist around the world in terms of how education systems are beginning to see the intersecting dimensions of climate change and how educational responses can really, leverage community resources and community assets for increased resilience. So I will stop there. We can talk a little bit more about design principles and that kind of stuff later, but I want to make sure to kick it over to Eugene to give us a little bit about his work. Over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Christina. I will share my screen. And just want to make sure you can all see that. So, hi, I'm Eugene. I'm as an introduction, I'm from San Jose, California. And I worked traditionally as a climate scientist, and I looked at model projections of the future. And some of them look like what we see on the right is, oh, things are always going up and it's getting worse and worse. And I think we all want to see more of what's on the left. And that is, a healthier, cleaner planet for everyone. And so I started to think about, what can I do? And this is kind of my personal story as an introduction. What can I do about climate change? And here's all these great solutions that are happening around the world. But what am I good at? And the only thing that I felt I had some expertise was about education. And because I'm a professor and I'm curious about, education and got very interested in reading the literature. But what I discovered was that when I saw a climate action plan at the local level, this is an example of San Jose's climate action plan, or at the state or national level, that we wouldn't see education in that collection of solutions. And so the question that came to my mind is, why not? Why aren't we seeing that there? And one of the reasons that I suspected was we didn't have good data. And I know folks here this is about a decade ago when I started this. So there's better and better data, but there wasn't as much. And so my question was, can we quantify the potential role of education as a mitigation tool? And so that work started about a decade ago. And I started tinkering with our university classes and started reading the literature, like what is effective methods of inspiring student engagement, activism, behavior change. Some of the folks in this session, I'm sure, have contributed to our communal understanding about this. And we took some of these ideas, we iterated, we tried things, and then we were seeing really good feedback from students. And we've been teaching this class at San Jose State for over a decade. It's an intentional one-year class that focuses on climate change, but from multiple perspectives: science, social science, behavior change, policy, communication, and it's a general course for students. And so what we did, and we'd heard amazing anecdotes of students after taking this one-year class of their experiences, is we surveyed these students at least 5 years after they had graduated from San Jose State. So like years, some of them were almost 10 years later. And we used some various tools surveys basically, to try to see, well, what is their lifestyle like today? And can we attribute some of that to their educational experience, almost a decade ago? And we found that the cars they drive and the food they eat and their personal behaviors were quite different compared to the average Californian. And we could discuss later some of the methodology, but our learning was, my goal and our goal of our team was to try to quantify the long-term impact that education can have. And we have some amazing anecdotes of students who have changed their career trajectory to work in more, environmentally focused careers. One student in Cupertino, who's obviously graduated, running for school board because he wanted more climate change for his own children. And here's what we learned. This was a headline from a paper that we published last year. And the headline says, high quality climate change education can be as effective in reducing carbon emissions as other solutions such as rooftop solar or battery electric vehicles. And in the kind of educational approach, that's a claim that we're making. What's the evidence and reasoning to support that? I'll share that with you briefly. But we took the Project Drawdown solutions that have been presented. This came out a few years ago, and where they showed, these are large scale kind of systemic changes that we can make to rooftop solar or wind or electric vehicles. And these scenarios show like very large reductions in carbon emissions. And what we kind of looked at or explored is, what if we did education at a similar kind of scale? What if we had high quality climate change education that's focused on solutions, focused on building student confidence, leadership, like we did in this course? And what if we took the same results we got from these students, which incidentally was about 2.9 tons of carbon reduced per year compared to the average Californian? What if we scaled that appropriately to high income and middle income countries? And our result was that that climate change education can be as impactful as other climate change strategies. And so it should be placed on par with all those other things. But as Christina described eloquently, it's not happening, it's not getting through. So this is just one additional data piece that we have to try to encourage folks to do two things. One is to pay attention to education, and two is to let's measure more. Let's do more of this. Let's produce more evidence. Now, in terms of my story, the course model of how we created this high quality education is an active area of discussion. And this was our model, and it includes things like social norms and empathy for the environment. And we could discuss, what does good climate change education look like as well? And there would be some opinions, but there's some general consensus that it isn't just, oh, I'll teach you the science and then everything will miraculously happen. And that it's more complicated than that, but not especially challenging to do. So we published this paper last year, and you can go look it up. And perhaps people in this community will go look it up and read the paper. But we know that most of the folks we're trying to reach actually won't go and read the paper. So we actually created a documentary, a PBS documentary that was screened last year as a tool for trying to get, here's another avenue for trying to encourage people to think, education should be part of the solution deck. And then kind of as a final piece of my personal journey and our team, and that was, what does this look like if we were to take this approach for climate change education and think of it as an applied research project and get it into schools? So that's where we created this Green Ninja educational, we're a science education publisher. And we've been working in California. We're an approved science publisher in California for middle school grades. We've taken this research, this data, and we've created a commercial science curriculum. And because when we gave it away for free, it didn't work and it didn't scale. But when we compete against Pearson, McGraw-Hill, Huffman Mifflin Harcourt, and we produce a better product than them, then we start to see districts sign 8-year contracts to adopt our textbook compared to other textbooks. And our plan now is to go into other states across the country using this similar approach. It's not the easiest way, but what it does is it's a necessary part. At least I see this as taking the science and the data, and then this is one path. We need the policy support, we need the grassroots, but we're hoping that other publishers will follow us when we start to get more market share. Other publishers will take note and say, gosh, we do really need to put more climate change education, because right now the stuff that's in there in today's commercial marketplace is definitely not enough. It's 1 or 2 weeks at the end of a weather and climate unit. It doesn't really have the social piece, doesn't have the human heart, and it's not quite going to get us there. So that's been what I've been working on, and I do want to thank the folks in the BECC community and also the researchers in science ed who have kind of laid the foundation for how do we really do this, and I'm just helping to work on the other side to try to get it in schools. So that's my introduction.
Thank you so much, Eugene. I think we get to see the passion, and we get to see how personal lives are so intertwined with professional lives on this climate education journey. So wonderful to see that. Few questions on my end. The first question for Alison. Alison, you described the psychosocial factors. So what kind of, climate change education can help to overcome the psychosocial factors to which have inaction against, any kind of climate change that is happening? Just to give a personal example, I think as an immigrant here, as a South Asian immigrant here, I have a very different treatment to climate education, and the way I respond is very different. So the social aspects are very different as well. So I don't know if you see any kind of these ethnic, racial backgrounds. I know some of them you mentioned in the introduction, but what are those psychosocial barriers that you see and the inaction that we need to avoid in climate change?
Great question. So yeah, I think the main thing we're seeing so far is right that it is just above the knowledge and awareness. So you do have to take in, that's kind of like the big takeaway point, that what we were hoping to find and what we are finding is that, yeah, you have to pay attention to these psychosocial barriers, looking at things like culture and looking at things like social norms. And really what we're seeing is that we have to kind of rethink the way we think education, right? It really has to be this transformative education, right? That pays attention to things like climate justice, and so that it's not just like science focused, that it's also the social, it's the cultural, it's the economic, it's so that folks, youth or adults, see these connections about sustainability and everything. And then really what we're finding is a lot of people do care, but they don't know how to take the action, right? And so really that's why we're saying like a solution focused, kind of education. And so when you're talking solutions, it will then become obvious, right, that climate change isn't just like a science issue, that it is social and economic as well. So it's really this idea of transformative, like solution-based, skill-based education to overcome these that everyone comes from a different context, that's able to recognize that and act on it.
Thank you so much, Alison. We'll come back to you, and we have lots of questions for you, but I also want to give chance to the other speakers as well as the audience to keep asking the question. Just a reminder, please keep sending your questions in the chat for each one of our panelists. Christina, you gave an overview of COP26. Does it leave you hopeful? Does it leave you dejected? I know a lot of protests are happening outside COP26. And also my question is, how do we mobilize? There's this difference between national level initiatives and local level initiatives. Do you see COP26 as bridging the gap between the two, or do you feel that local initiatives are going in a different direction and the national initiatives are going in a completely different direction?
Yeah, well, I want to say that my feeling this last week and a half has definitely been one of just, a lot, I wouldn't say a full loss of hope, but I was getting there. But I was getting there primarily because, these statements were coming out, and draft statements and draft decisions, and it wasn't where we wanted it to be, right? But I'm also hopeful because I think over the last 2 to 3 years, we've really seen broad scale mobilization, primarily led by youth voices around the world. And they are, as President Obama, or former President Obama, made a speech at COP26 yesterday, or was that today? I can't even remember. And he urged these young people to stay angry, stay frustrated, and to channel that into grassroots mobilization and grassroots action. And I agree, like that is where things need to happen at the state level, state as in country level, national level. There is so much politicking when it comes to the decisions that are made, oftentimes behind closed doors, not non-inclusive processes, even though these processes are supposed to be inclusive. And making 11th hour changes that retract really significant language that could help set in motion all the trickle down policy infrastructure and budget targets and everything like that, right? So to your point, or to your question, is it making the bridge between international global discussions and local action? It's not, but it is certainly where it clashes. And where it clashes, I think that's where the energy comes to really mobilize that more local level action. And researchers, Chad Frischman and Avik Bomik and Abby Rusky and others have done research looking at, again, Project Drawdown solutions and looking at it at different levels of scale. to try to understand where's our biggest bang for our buck when it comes to climate action and its impact on actual climate outcomes. And that's at district level, that's at meta community levels, it's at levels of 100,000 or so people. And so when we think about where can action really be tapped into, that is the local level, that's the grassroots mobilization. That's, you know, talking to a district and saying, hey, here's this curriculum over here that can really begin to infuse critical discussions around science as well as justice issues, right? And then leveraging that out. Climate action projects, community-based climate action projects in every school is another way to unlock that potential. So, you know, while I'm losing more and more hope, I think there's, you know, I'm joining the crowd that feels that the COP26 just isn't worth anybody's time, and really thinking, you know, how do we better connect all of the different networks of local community, you know, community action to really begin to scale up those efforts, you know, tap into the C40s initiative, for example, that's being led by 40 mayors around the world, and really using the city level as the driver for action. Because that is where, you know, a lot of these, you know, that's where we can sort of see the positive returns to our actions. It's at that smaller scale. And I think that's where I find hope. Let's put our energies there.
On that very hopeful note, you give me a lot of hope on the local action. I completely believe in it. And thanks for reiterating the fact that we need to believe in local actions. Eugene, what does climate action look like for you? I know you mentioned the book that you worked on for, you know, textbooks for school, but in terms of the other things that schools need to take on, we know the whole school language approach, and but is there any specific things that you would like the schools to see to make this climate action possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one thing that comes to mind is for schools to start to, and this is just exactly what Christina was talking about, is for schools to realize how important a place they play in their own community. So, you know, they are large energy users, they have transportation kind of connections, they have their own facilities. But when the school starts to think of their system as a learning lab for their students, then and it's not just science, but this could be language arts, it could be the history, social studies, all fields. And your state of New Jersey has done a good job. It was mentioned in the chat about their climate change standards throughout all K-12 curriculum. That if we start to think of a theme of our school around sustainability, you can call it whatever you want to call it, then you might start to think, and if you have some kind of leadership at the school, or you have students driving this, then you can start to approach what happens inside your walls, but then also that kind of system connection between your school and what happens outside. So just to give you an example, we have a school district that purchased the Green Ninja program for 8 years. And we become trusted partners with that school district. And so when we give them ideas, they'll listen to it because they realize that we actually care about their students and their teachers. So when we came back from the pandemic, we said to the district leadership, why don't you think about an outdoor education program in your schools? Because, okay, it's safer for your students, but also a lot of their sites are just concrete and they're really not great living spaces. And for whatever reason, the district leadership was like, oh, we really like that idea. And so we have a new outdoor education program, and those things take time. But this is the type of and what we're trying to do is, and then we're going to start to look at their dining waste and the waste that's coming out of the school. And students are doing projects about transportation and about, you know, idling cars as they're waiting to drop off and pick up. And so in answer to your question, what are we looking for? We're looking for kind of this rethinking of the role that education can play in our community. And I think that maybe in a few years that Christina and her colleagues, super scientists, will be looking at these 40 cities or looking at some districts and starting to see from space or from data that change is actually happening at that local level, and that students are the architects and designers of those changes.
Nice. Thanks, Eugene. I think you also make a lot of connection to what Alison mentioned, to make them problem solvers and have this, you know, lab kind of system so that you learn from the experiences. But there's a good question. I think Christina answered a part of it on teacher professional development. And if you ask me how can this be done in school, and if I'm a teacher, I think I would definitely feel very, because I'm not a, I don't have complete knowledge of everything. So it's very natural that teachers without any professional development, obviously it takes a lot of time to develop this curriculum. And now we in New Jersey, we have this curriculum. Teachers are going through this professional development experience, but what will it take for us to support the teachers? How can we bridge the gap between the community and the teachers? Any ideas from any one of you? Thanks, Federica, for sending that great question. Open to any three of you, maybe a couple of sentences each from all of you would be great.
I'll just start since I was just chatting. You can spend all your time in academia or wherever you want and create this great curriculum, but what you learn very quickly is that the teachers are the real, you need to support teachers. And so teacher professional development, teacher training and support ongoing there's a critical need to that. And one of the things I was happy to see in New Jersey is that there is some funding for teacher training. If you're going to introduce these new standards and these new ideas, then teachers are going to need support and ongoing support. How do you do that? With empathy, with care, understanding the local context, and helping teachers see that first initial success in the first academic year, I think is really important. It does take a lot of work. It can take personal coaching even at the individual teacher level. But if you have the support to do that ongoing, I think you can produce successful results.
Thank you, Jean.
And I think Washington State's Climb Time initiative is an excellent example of how state-backed teacher professional development programs can begin to integrate climate change in ways that really, tap into teachers' interests and then, connect to different curricular areas. I mean, right now, I think, or traditionally, Climb Time has been focused on climate science and climate science teachers, professional development, but are increasingly going beyond the sciences to demonstrate to non-science teachers how to incorporate climate change into their work. And I think, when we think back to like, how do we set teachers up to integrate climate change into their classrooms, regardless of what it is, we begin to shift into discussions about how do we do quality education? Because as others are saying, it's not just about teaching the facts. It's about different pedagogical approaches. It's about tapping into different kinds of knowledges, not just thinking about traditional science knowledge, but also indigenous knowledge, social knowledge, effectiveness knowledge, all different aspects that begin to integrate all the, different aspects of cognition and being and thinking. And, this then gets us into like, how do we, really begin to teach in quality ways that leverage the transformative potential of education. So we're not just, teaching technical skills to, turn out, green workforce folks, but we're turning out people who understand sustainability and understand systems issues that cause certain kinds of reverberating impacts in places that they can't see, but know will come back and impact them in some other ways and somehow, right? So I think we begin to shift into discussions about how do we improve the quality of our teaching, the quality of our education systems. And it's not just how do we integrate a specific technical aspect of climate change into our schools, like we might integrate, another, subject area, but it's really how do we transform our teaching?
Thank you, Christina. Alison?
Yeah, those were great points, Christina and Eugene. And I can just say though, as a former teacher, right, you're so overwhelmed, right? And so if someone comes with you with another topic, another curriculum, you're just like, and so what I like to say here is that it's not on all our teachers, right? And that someone else in the chat had mentioned the role of informal and non-formal ed too. So our teachers don't feel like they're so alone and having to carry this burden. Certainly they have a part, and I think, this idea of the transformative education and all of that's so important. And then also just to make sure we're giving equal attention to, right, to non-formal and informal educators to help out our teachers who particularly in this pandemic time have just been so stressed. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Alison. My next question is actually about informal education, which Debbie and Therese, I think, mentioned about churches being a part, adult education being a part of it. And I feel that it's always we've always neglected informal education efforts because they are very difficult to measure. We don't have evidence to it. And how do you really measure what goes on inside homes and mothers' connections through WhatsApp and other things? In my experience, I've seen that a lot of organizing is done through WhatsApp, through mothers saying, okay, no, this, we shouldn't be doing this plastic bag, and this school needs to control this. And so a lot of that organizing is done through the PTOs. A lot of that organizing is done outside formal school systems. But any data or any research that you can point out to see how we can bring those informal education efforts back into climate education, but more systematically maybe, or maybe some approaches or frameworks that you can suggest?
Can I maybe jump in with a side example? Because this reminds me tremendously of the work that the field of girls' education has been working on for decades. And so my academic background is actually in girls' education, gender and education, especially in low and middle income country contexts. And one of the key things that folks in that field are focused on is not just trying to remove barriers to access in education systems, but also the social gender norms and the community practices that are outside of school buildings that influence whether or not girls can go to school or whether or not girls can access certain kinds of opportunities. And that is about the community engagement. That's about linking schools with communities, schools with parents, and really beginning to do the mindset shifts and the community norms shifts outside of the school walls in order to influence what happens inside the school walls. So I think the parallels are there. And I think that there are probably many lessons we can learn from that kind of work, because like climate change, it can be very quickly an ideological issue, one of deep embedded norms and beliefs about how the world works and how the world works. And you can very quickly run against barriers. And I think that there's perhaps many lessons that we can learn from that community of practice around community norms shifting, which entails engaging in non-formal and informal learning spaces and learning activities and awareness raising. So I think that's potentially a space to kind of tap into.
Thank you, Christina. Eugene or Allison?
Thanks. So in our lab too, one of the other projects I work on is this idea of collective environmental literacy. And it's taken this idea of, science literacy at the individual level and environmental literacy at the individual level, and how exactly what we all were saying, that it spreads in a community in order to take collective action. And we're having a lot of success using collective action frameworks and, what motivates collective action. And, again, like talk about WhatsApp or Nextdoor, you see a lot of the social media. And so but as Christine said, it's so hard to measure these changes, and exactly what Eugene was saying too, then tie that change to a change in the environment as well, showing that it's making an impact on CO2 emissions or something like that. And so we're looking at social network analysis and doing like community listening sessions and really trying to figure out how are folks coming together, right? And is it we need one central leader, or is it that everyone knows a little bit and they get together and exchange this information? And so it's really tapping into this collective power. And at the same time, we try to acknowledge that the individuals still make a difference, right? So it's not just a group effort. You still have to, so that's why it's so complicated, right? You're trying to change things at the individual level and at the collective. And then it's so hard to measure that. So it's tough. Yeah, it's a challenge.
Thank you, Allison.
Yeah, I noticed that people are also asking in the chat about adult education. And, as a college professor, these are adults. And I'll just tell you from my own experience that I could teach a 15-week class in climate change. And then when I survey them at the end of 15 weeks, if I didn't do a good job, they'd be like, yeah, climate change is happening, I guess. And I guess it's kind of important, but it isn't really going to affect me. And it didn't, 15 weeks of, 30 hours or 60 hours of instruction may not do it unless it's well designed. So I think, like the work that Allison and some folks that are working in informal ed, they don't have the benefit of a whole year of academic, time to do this. They have to do it in a much more efficient way and use other types of strategies. And certainly there are lots of great examples of people inspiring adults to get involved. I just signed up for the Cool Block program, which is this hyper-local thing where you try to organize. But And it's true, some of those things are hard to measure. It doesn't mean there's not a lot of merit behind that.
So basically, we need to continue our own local initiatives, continue the informal education, and spread our impact. It's difficult to measure, as we have all mentioned here. Actually, this question is also about community level or county level work. I think Tonya mentions it here. It's an important question because I see that at the county level, there are many trainings happening on various different aspects. In her county, Tonya's county, they mentioned that it is climate change and health curriculum is being now they have to develop it for 20,000 employees. Any similar models that we can find from other places or other aspects which we can think of at the county level? In some cases, they want to tag along this climate change education or curriculum for these employees in many different counties, but they don't have, many people are still looking for what that curriculum looks like, or even like I want to call it some sort of a climate equity, like an audit check where the buildings are they energy efficient or not? Are the township initiatives looking at infrastructure, but also looking at climate change impact? So anything at the county level that has been inspiring or is a good example to look at, maybe any research paper that you've seen at the county level? I know Christina mentioned the cities initiative, mayors. Maybe we should all look at that more carefully and see which city mayor is aligning to closer to where we live in, and take those examples to our own townships. But anything at the county level that you want to bring up?
I don't know if I have any models. I do have a thought, though, that's something we're seeing more information on and people talking about more, is the need to include adaptation in the curriculums now, and particularly at county levels. That seems highly appropriate. And someone earlier had a great question about farmers too, and if we had seen any in our review, had we seen farmers as as emerge as an audience? And we did, and it was mostly in relation to adaptation. Really, they were the only studies that focused on adaptation. Almost everything else was on mitigation, and it was the farmers that had a big focus on adaptation. And so, when you see, in California with the fires and just the flooding in New York, in the U.S., we're already seeing these impacts. And so I don't know that we talk enough about adaptation and some of this climate change education and communication. And certainly from a research point, that there has to be more research done on that. How do we address adaptation, alongside mitigation as well?
Thank you, Alison. Really good points. I've seen a lot of discussion on insurance and flood insurance as an aftermath of what has happened, but not anything on disaster risk mitigation or adaptation or other things that we need to be thinking of, even at the school level. So a lot of grounds to cover there, but any other county level initiative that we can think of?
I know something that hopefully will be coming down the pikes very soon, and that's thinking about at the county level, certain, I think Miami-Dade might be one of them, and then I believe there might be one in Eastern Kentucky as well, that are focused on electrifying their school buses, and how the electrification of the school bus is the entry point to a whole set of systems transformations. So it's not only how do you get electric school buses into the county, but it's how do you get the manufacturing set up, the supply chain, the workers trained up to operate and maintain a new electric fleet, the utility system, but then most importantly, using the electric school buses as an entry point for curricular expansion and curricular integration of energy systems, air pollution, and even getting into the social justice aspects of why we have school buses in the first place, and how that might attend to just ideas of just transition as we're thinking about ensuring no communities are left behind as we try to transfer to renewable energy sources. So I think it's not here yet. I think it's coming soon, hopefully soon. And this is at least an example of one way that you can really leverage cross-sectoral county level action that can then also transform what is being taught in the classroom and how it's being taught. Very experiential based, project-based learning that can happen there.
That is really important to note. I think we need to get that system-wide thinking across different, different departments of the town, which can be a good learning experience for students to be sitting in these township meetings, as well as learning from them and bringing that content to school, including, maybe asking the teachers, if we have this storm, what's going to happen, which areas will be affected, why are they affected, why are those people living there, what is, bringing in that climate justice element into the picture. I think, as Christine is mentioning, is really important, and bringing in these initiatives into the curriculum. Sometimes we do all these things and the students are left out, and they suddenly have these buses with electrical buses with with no connection to the curriculum, and I see that happening a lot. So that's a really important point, that all these township initiatives that are there, how are they impacting the curriculum, and how can the curriculum take these local examples, and is the curriculum first of all open enough, is flexible enough to incorporate all these ideas. I think is really critical to go forward, to make those sustainability, make those students as sustainability managers and change agents in their communities, and asking the right questions and discussing those in the classes. I think should be the way to go forward, based on what you all the three of you, I think, have a similar kind of thread going, that let's bring in all these aspects. Let it not be just science education, let it all be integrated, let it be experiential, have some sort of lab work going on in the school that brings in all these aspects together and connect to community initiatives, national initiatives, and keep the energy going and keep pushing forward, because this is, I almost think that this is changing the status quo, and it's every time we change something, it takes a long time and it takes a lot of energy. So I hope all the participants here also continue engaging our panelists with the same amount of energy. And thank you to the three of you to bring in all these important aspects and to tie them together. Really grateful to have the three of you here share all your ideas.